It's like they almost expect
Well,
China to be
it's our media. Our media is really good at framing us as only the good guy and everybody else is the bad guy. And
exactly.
that was one thing that I came to realize when I was in the military is that in actuality, it's kind of like I'm forgetting his name right now. I'm a Star Wars character where he's one of the stormtroopers and he kind of realizes that wait a minute, I'm kind of on the bad guys team. And that's kind of what I felt like when I was in the military because when I start realizing, well, wait a minute, I thought we were here to like give freedom and help and do all this, and I realized that what the military does is it compartmentalizes. It shows some of the people one side and other people are doing other sides. So my first couple of years, we were helping with clearing minefields in Bosnia, Kosovo, and things like that, and helping for people to be able to come back in and resettle the areas. Well, by the time 9/11 comes around, uh, we're spending more time protecting Western contractors going in and export resources out. And so some people might be in an administrative posts. Some people might be getting the information that they're going after a terrorist. And then others of us might be guarding executives. So, I mean, it's, you know, the way they compartmentalize and keep us from seeing the whole entire picture, I feel the government does that as a whole. Do you agree?
Yeah, I mean, I think I told before we start the show, I told you about my experience. You know, going attending a majority black school in Southside Chicago back in
Mm-hmm.
1990s, and like the recruiter would come, military recruiter will come regularly, like almost every semester. They'll come to give the talk, and it's always the same talk. And he's like, "Okay, kids, you know, if you want to get out of the ghetto."
Mm-hmm.
If you want to leave, if you don't want to live a life of crime, you know, if you don't want to end up in prison, we are your best chance. Join us.
Yes.
Like, sign up with the military. We get you out of here. And
Mm-hmm.
that like they just tell it straight up. And yeah, I mean that's how US that's how US functions. You know, people kind of, I don't know, we because sometimes we live in US, we're so immersed in this all these fucked up shit. Sometimes we just kind of take it for granted. Oh, okay,
Yeah.
yeah, it just happens. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
uh,
Yeah. I've had people before say, well, and I've been kind of fighting this question back and forth with people who say, well, America's the greatest country. It's the greatest place you can live. And I'm like, well, everything is perspective. If you find somebody beautiful or intelligent or stupid or whatever you want to say, everything is all perspective. And I'm like, from somebody who's lived overseas, I was stationed in Italy and in Spain, and then living in Puerto Rico also for a brief time, and then traveling like many countries. I wasn't fortunate enough to go to the Asian continent. Well, major Asia, but Turkey. It's technically Asia, but I didn't really get into like the heart of Asia, which I wanted to go to. So um, outside of that, I've gotten to see a lot of different things. And what I learned is every country and nation has their pros and cons. And it's easy to demonize one nation or prop up another nation, especially when you're ignorant of these other nations.
yeah, yeah, I agree.
I was wondering, let's because there's been a lot heating up with this whole Ukraine and China, Ukraine and Russia and China, they've had these partnerships that they've been kind of working on, and I know China has been doing more outreach and partnerships with other nations. Some of it in the global South, some of it into parts of Africa. And I was wondering, like, what's some of your takes and perspectives, and on some of those different things which China has been doing as far as global partnerships and moves? Because I know China's not like the U.S. The U.S. and most of these Western countries, they're in 2 year, 4 year, 6 year increments and things like that. Whereas a nation like China thinks in much broader, time periods. I believe it's what, like 25 years that they do, like 25-year goals. You could correct me if I'm wrong, but just wondering, like, what's your take on like where China is now, where China's looking to go? I know that they've said economically that they are looking to push to be, to no longer be kind of beneath the U.S. and they're looking at the multi-hegemonic world instead of United States being, the sole hegemony. So I was wondering, like, all of that. I know it was a lot, a big, long question, but what do
Sure.
you think?
So China actually have good relationship with both Russia and Ukraine, right? I mean,
Mm.
I mean, because China pursue what's so-called non-interference foreign policy. Like whatever happens in your country, that's your problem. Like that's for your people to deal with. Which is quite different from the U.S. interventionist foreign
Yes.
policy, all right? Because we always ready to exporting democracy everywhere
China,
at a
China,
moment's notice.
the U.S. I look at how I say it. Sorry to interrupt, but the U.S. I see is the Karen of the world. It's in every single body's business.
Yep. And it's the thing is, I think before it was some kind of evangelical zeal back in the late 19th century and early 20th century, because we just want to go out and convert everybody to Christianity. Now, instead of Christianity, our religion is like freedom and democracy.
And don't forget capitalism.
Yes, and now we just go because before they were spreading capitalism before they were spreading Christianity and capitalism. Now they just spread freedom, democracy, and capitalism, right? They just replace the Christianity
Democracy.
with,
Yeah.
and so it's quite ridiculous. I mean, like China has friendly relationship with Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Israel. Like all three very antagonistic countries, because China's like
and India.
as long as we can do business, I don't care what who your enemy with, your friends with. But that's not how U.S. work. U.S. is like either you're with us
or you're against. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, about the China's Belt and Road Initiative, which one major part aim is to connect China productive capacity with the market in Europe, and through the Eurasian land bridge through Russia. And this part actually right now that part is on hold because the war going on in Ukraine.
Yeah.
So from China's perspective, China actually very much like the war to be over. China does not like war. China wants stability, because stability is the foundation for trade, for more interconnectivity. But at the same time, because China's relationship with Russia, China doesn't want Russia to fail, to come out of this conflict weakened in front of NATO. So that's why China is providing an economic lifeline to Russia. But from China's perspective, you very much like this conflict just get wrapped up so they can get back to the business of building infrastructures connecting Eurasia, right?
Yeah.
And the project of Belt and Road Initiative officially started 2012, around the time when Xi Jinping came to power. But this is just a official formulation. What China is actually doing has started long before that, back in early 2000. And it's really just a call it Belt and Road Initiative. It's just really providing a term to describe what China is doing, which is providing investment, building infrastructures all over the world, but particularly in the global South. China's philosophy is if you build it, they will come, right? And by building the now there's a lot of talks in the Western media about how China is debt trapping countries like Africa, right? But when talking about that, they're actually taking away the agency away from the African people, from the African government, who willingly enter the agreement with China, right? China is not sending its aircraft carrier to African countries and say, here, sign the dotted line here, right? It's a mutual agreement between the African nations and China to come together and sign up for the infrastructure project. So this is very facetious for people to claim what China is doing is some kind of neo-colonialism or neo-imperialism, because it's very different from, say, Belgian Congo when
Oh
you
yeah, with King
know,
Leopold.
right, when Leopold's men were cutting off people's arms and legs for not
Hmm.
fulfilling the quota of procuring ivory, right? I mean, like
Yeah.
right now it's the African governments who are signing sovereign. They're sovereign African nations who
Hmm.
signed the deal with China. It's a mutual bilateral agreement. So that's a big difference. But
And
also,
and and I would add, even sorry to interrupt you, but I would add in that even if China did kind of get the better of some of these countries in the deal, you're working out a deal, and that's what deals are about. Where my issue comes in is when things are done like the US way, where coups and things like that are done to force the change. If a leader makes a deal and it doesn't necessarily balance out the way they want, okay, that happens in business. And so as long as it's just on the economic competition level, I don't feel that's wrong, right?
yeah, I mean, U.S. is financing wars in DRC for a long time. Just this is, I mean, it's crazy. Like they talk about China's predatory loans or whatever. Like no, that's what IMF and World Bank has been doing for decades. Like what China is doing is offer alternative to IMF and World Bank, so the African nations don't have to with their hats in high hand to go to IMF or World Bank. They
Hmm.
have there's third option. The China they have one more choice. They can choose, and they're being butthurt right now because now they don't have that monopoly on the
Hmm.
African resources anymore. And
Well,
and
oh, sorry, go ahead.
and another point is somehow this is China's trapping. When China builds a port on the coast of Africa, everybody can use that port. It's not like the port is only open to
Hmm.
Chinese shipping, right? I mean, it's a freaking port sitting on the ocean. Anybody can come into the port and do trade, and that increased global connectivity by many folds, right? I mean, it's it's kind of the question is really why are not Western multinationals investing more in Africa? That is the question they're not asking,
Yeah,
right? I
they're
mean,
not. They're all about extraction.
exactly. Exactly. Only thing they care about is oil, gas, and some diamonds and minerals, right? That's only thing that they care about. Anything other than that, I mean,
Hmm.
China at least was um, building textile factories in places like Ethiopia, hiring local workforce, right? I mean,
Hmm.
why is Western nation not doing that? I mean, I mean, like people don't ask these questions. Instead,
No, that's why I wanted to have you here to have this discussion so that people can hear this side and start thinking about it in
yeah,
different viewpoints, which most people don't. Because
yeah,
everybody we're given, especially for, and I would say in America, and you know this too, maybe the older Gen X crowd to the baby boomer crowd who, and you remember it, back in the days when you only had a handful of evening news and all that, and everybody will watch all the same stuff. And now that's changed from that evening ABC, CBS, Fox, to now MSNBC, CNN, or Fox News. And even though they say they don't trust these networks, their behavior and their thought patterns show something different.
it's really weird because like when it comes to domestic politics, right? We like the U.S. is very polarized.
Mm-hmm.
The Democrats say, oh, Fox News this bullshit, and the conservatives like, oh yeah, like CNN, these are all like fake news. But when it comes to foreign when it comes to like foreign reporting, these news channels literally just taking the line straight from the State Department, and we just take it, we swallow it hook, line, and sinker, right?
Yes,
And it's like
yes.
we you don't, and even for some of the leftists in US, they have learned to distrust US mainstream media in reporting about Latin America, for example, on Cuba, Venezuela,
Mm-hmm.
Bolivia, right? but then they still believe what U.S. media everything it says about China, right? Like it's like this weird disconnect. I mean, I can understand because there's people are maybe more familiar with Latin America. There's a degree of familiarity. You kind of understand the context more, and because there's so much ignorance about China, people unless they're get their news, they go on the internet and actively search out alternative voices, they won't know anything about China. If you living in US, you're living like this bubble, like
Well, it's the
information.
same. It's the same thing that we say about what's going on in Russia.
Yeah.
I mean, I myself personally dig for information. So I would say I'm different than some other people because I'm constantly seeking this out. But even though I seek it out, it's still hard for me to even find stuff, and I'm looking for it. I mean, how is it for people who aren't looking for it? Had a question here, I guess in the chat that I figured I'll go ahead and ask this. It says, he wanted me to ask you about China's relationship with World Economic Forum. Now, of course, I have my opinions, but I'll let you lay out what you think.
Okay. Well, China has benefited from globalization because I witnessed that happening. I'm a later tail end of Gen X, right? So I was born in 1976. When I grew up I was born in China in 1976, 1 month after Mao died. When I was a child, China was still a very, very poor country, and I still remember, 1980. That was a time when my mom used her lifetime saving to buy her parents, my grandparents, a black and white television. And that was the only television in the neighborhood. So all the neighborhood kids would come to
Wow.
my grandma's house to watch TV. That was 1980. And then in early 80s, China couldn't even produce its own color TV or fridge. Everything has to be imported. Back in the early 80s, China is in many ways typical global South nation. It exported raw resources, commodities, and received imported manufactured goods. So China back then was an oil exporter. It exported crude oil to Japan and import everything from chemical fertilizer to transistor radio. Like I remember back in 80 was really cool hip thing to score a Japanese made radio. and
Wow.
my parents we and back then everything was on ration. Like rationing still exists. The government issue you ration that allow you to buy a meat, rice, flour, even clothes. And me as a 13-year-old in China, as a teenage boy, I had more rice ration allotment than rest of my family because I'm a growing adolescent. And so the ration was a thing up till late 80s, just before I left China. And it's only in the like early 80s they allowed what's called the farmers market, or they call it the free market back in China, but it's really equivalent of farmers market in US. And now the US media would call it wet market. So the farmers will come from countryside and bring their produce directly selling to the urban residents, whereas before that you have to go to government stores to purchase these goods. So in those farmers market, the price is not fixed. It's not fixed by the government, and you have to haggle. And that was my favorite thing as a child, to go with my grandma to go to this market and see live chicken and stuff like that. But so China went through a lot of changes.
Yeah.
I remember in 1986, again 1980, because my dad came to United States in 1985. He was the first generation Chinese students after Cultural Revolution to come to US to study. So he sent back his savings to China that allowed my mom to exchange the US dollar for, back then called the foreign exchange certificate. That allowed my mom to go to a specific store called the Friendship Store that only that sells imported goods, but you have to have hard currency. Like you have to have this foreign exchange certificate. And so my mom bought a Panasonic color TV. Again, that was the first color TV in our neighborhood. All the kids would
Wow.
come to our house and watch the TV. And that was a time when China doesn't even make its own color TV. It's
Mm-hmm.
only, but 1 year later, in 1987, I noticed then my so at that time my dad sent back savings so we could buy these Japanese made color TV, Japanese made fridge. But just few years later, a couple years later, I noticed my friend's family, whose parents didn't go overseas, they're starting to purchase Chinese made color TV and refrigerator. So it's really like a very fast change. I think the higher the refrigerator maker only started producing refrigerator in 1986. So before this was a before I live in the before made in China era. I live in the
Mm-hmm.
era where China exported soybeans, crude oil, pigskin, whatever, like raw commodity in exchange for manufactured goods. But in the span of what 30-40 years,
Mm-hmm.
China totally transformed into the world's factory. And it did that by joining joining the existing the trade, the US led so-called globalization effort, right?
Yeah.
Because US, a lot of the capitalists here, they always chasing the lowest
Mm-hmm.
highest margin and lowest cost.
Yep.
The first offshore all the manufacturing to all these US client states around East Asia, like Taiwan,
Yeah.
Taiwan, South Korea,
Vietnam.
Singapore, yeah, Hong Kong. Those were the four Asian tigers, right? Like,
Yep.
and then after that, after 1980s, when China opened up, they're like, wait a minute, China is even cheaper than these
Mm-hmm.
than Taiwan and Korea and Hong Kong. Let's go over there. So that's when also China start building its own infrastructure in the belief that if you build it, they will come. And so
Mm-hmm.
they have tax incentives to invite all these factories to come, because at that time when I was in China in 1980, China already reached 1 billion figure for population. So there's a lot of young people that needed jobs. And China said, okay, if the state factories can't provide all the jobs, then we'll let the private industries come in and to provide jobs for them. And another thing is that before 1980s, there was something called the hukou, or the resident registration system. A lot of the people in the countryside, they stay in the countryside. So 80% of the Chinese population in 1980 was rural. They live on
Mm-hmm.
the farms. And when China finally opened up, they allowed the rural migrants to come to the cities to work. And that's when it kind of started this whole urbanization drive. And then China decided, okay, we're just going to build out more cities. They're going to build out infrastructure. Because my dad's hometown, Hailin in Zhejiang, when I left in 1990, I remember the tallest building in town was this the only three-story building that was like a Bank of China building, but doubled up as a post office, and a whole bunch of other government building. But when I returned in 2001, I was very shocked to discover it's now a medium-sized city. I'm like, where did all these people come from?
Yeah.
And then I start hearing, because my dad's hometown is on the east coast of China. It's about 45 minutes south of Shanghai. Then, but on the street, I start hearing people speaking Sichuanese, which is
Mm-hmm.
the dialect from
Versus what? Oh,
where
and
my
what
mother.
in your father's region, was it Mandarin?
No, in father's region, they speak the Wu language, which is
Oh, okay.
the Shanghainese is part of the Wu language family. So their language is very close to the Shanghainese. It's mutually intelligible, and because they're only 45 minutes south of Shanghai,
Okay.
but by my dad's my dad's generation, everybody has been educated in Mandarin in school. So when I was growing up in China, we would speak Mandarin in class, but outside the class, of course, we speak our own local languages. And I grew up in my mother's city, which is on the southwest part of China. We speak a different language, and they speak we speak Sichuanese. And so in my father's city, I start hearing like my mother tongue is spoken everywhere. So I realized, okay, that click. All these rural migrants are now coming to
now moving over here now.
Yes, and these cities start to, and China had this urbanization plan to basically build out more cities to host, like the majority of the rural population back then was 800 million people, to move to these new cities to spur on like the industrialization and commercialization and urbanization of China. And that was a success. So this is how China was able to progress in the last 40 years. It leveraged on the fact that these Western capitalists, they will come, they will chase the lowest cost. They will come because China had a lot of high skilled labor, highly educated labor, because Mao, after Mao's
that's
China,
true.
they before communist victory, China literacy was very low. It was about like 10%. 90% of people were illiterate, but by 1980s, when I was born, the literacy was already 90%. So the Western multinational come to this place with highly educated, with a well-educated populace, but very low wages, right? So that's what they want. They just care about low wages.
I mean, it makes sense. It benefits them if you can get, very educated workforce for very, very low price. I mean, as a businessman, that's, especially as a capitalist, that's almost like irresistible.
Yeah. That's why from 1990s to, I say, 2010s, in United States, there's two opinions about China. There's a pro-containment camp, which mostly backed by Pentagon and the military-industrial complex, and there's a pro-engagement camp. And the pro-engagement camp was basically the U.S. business lobby, because they want to go make money in China. They want to go take advantage of this cheap labor and then maybe sell to the Chinese, because it's a potentially huge market. But what has changed in the last 5 years is that China have built up to the point where now the U.S. businesses felt that they're being threatened by the Chinese competition.
Yes.
So they're like, okay, maybe it was a mistake.
Like, we were fine with you building up, but you're building a little up too much.
Yeah,
you're getting too big for your britches now.
Exactly. So that's why now we see at the U.S. elite level, kind of the Cold War rhetoric against China is almost bipartisan. Both Democrats and Republicans, they're out competing with each other to see who is more tougher on China, right? But the experience, what I was trying to explain, I take a long way to get here, is that Chinese experience with globalization is very different from, say, American experience and other developed world experience. Because in America, what we have is hollowing out of manufacturing sector.
Yeah,
right. We got all these offsourced,
in which that adds to what you were talking about, that dichotomy of some people taking a very anti-China approach and some people taking a pro-China approach. Because if you're just a worker and you're like, well, my job is gone, that's all you think about and see. You don't really care that it's helping plenty of people being impoverished who are coming out of poverty and a nation being lifted up.
Yes. I mean, in U.S., kind of the U.S. worker are being offered this Faustian bargain, right? They're like, okay, yes, we take away your well-paying manufacturing job, but here's cheaper goods offered through Walmart, manufactured in China, and so that's how and we're back in the Clinton era. I remember Bill talk about, we'll just transition to the service economy, we'll transition into the knowledge-based economy, and everybody will learn how to code, right? And then, but what happened was then they discovered India as another place where
Yeah.
you can outsource all the service sectors, all the back out call centers, all the even coding, right? All the coding they can outsource to India. So that's why we have what do we have in US? So we just have money printing, right? That which led to real estate bubble, right? Which led
Well,
to the
real estate bubble, the supply chain issues,
yep.
so I mean a lot of issues. I mean, I just want to throw this little tidbit in because I remember when you would see images of China and it was mostly rural, and I
Yes.
remember only a few decades later watching it start to have skyscrapers all over the place.
Yep.
And I don't know, you might remember this or not. Do you remember the Nelson Atkins Museum? It was one of the major museums in Kansas City. It's
Oh
all right
yes,
if you
yes, I've
don't.
been there. I've been there once.
You're
I've been
with
there
the
once.
big birdies out in the
Yeah, yeah,
lawn.
yeah, 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 yeah. I've been there once.
When I was in school, I don't know why it happened this way, but my teacher would literally every year take us to the Chinese exhibit, and so we would do a lot of studying on that specific part in general. So it's always been a fascination for me. A lot of the things going on. Also, my uncle was really big into martial arts. It's a whole other story. Won't go into that, but I was wondering.
That's actually a very important connection between the Black community in U.S. and China. That's a
Mm-hmm.
lot of this Chinese connection got started, and
Mostly through martial arts.
Yeah,
Yeah.
martial arts.
I mean, especially in the 70s, my
Yeah.
uncle was really big on that. And if you think about it, I was born at the time you were talking about in the 80s, seeing a lot of those initiatives starting to change in China. You know, I was coming on the scene, a little one running around. And so I remember the early NAFTA days and the jobs starting to be shifted away, and watching the hollow out from stuff being made in the USA to starting to see less and less stuff made in the USA, because a lot of kids that are growing up in the US now don't remember any of the days where like 90% of actually probably like 95% of the stuff said made in USA on it.
I remember when I first came to US in 1990, I was so excited to find goods on the shelf that says made in China with made in China label. Like my parents bought me a made in China teddy bear in 1990 Christmas because we were so excited. It's like, oh my God, made in China. Okay, let's take this. and but like just few years later, then everything is made
Everything was made in China.
Yeah.